I always say that I'm the generation of 86. So I was 13 years old, organizing around rent boycotts in the East Rand with comrades. I grew up to be part of the student movement and then youth movement in KwaThema, in particularly on the East Rand. And then I went on, I think probably from 1989, I joined the Gay and Lesbian organization of the Witwatersrand, GLOW, and moved on to organize a lot around gay and lesbian rights and, of course, LGBTIQ rights, being part of the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality that campaigned for the decriminalization of same-sex laws and the retainment of the equality clause in our constitution. Went on like part of the women's rights movement, the feminist movement, and then of course organized globally as part of the International Gay and Lesbian Association, the LGBT South-South dialogue. I lived in Ecuador for 8 years, organized within the World Social Forum, the campaign against the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, and really an internationalist and part of many global struggles that ground me also in terms of what's going on and what continues to go on, both in South Africa and across the continent. Short history.
Thank you so much. But let's go back to the beginning. You said you were 13 years old when you were organizing boycotts and protests and so on. And what sort of drew you into doing those activities at that age? What was happening in your world at that time?
You can imagine the East Rand of 1986, right? Everything was on fire. There was a lot of campaigning, unions, UDF, and a lot of vibrant youth that actually, as part of my small network of activists, as a student activist at the time in the SRC and COSAS, it was impossible to ignore what was going on, what was even shaping the youth movement of the time, or the student movement. So the rent boycott, as you will recall, were also a mechanism to fight the apartheid government in relation to what they were wanting to do in our townships, you know, enforcing the payments of rent whilst ignoring the conditions that largely Black people were struggling against in relation to apartheid. And at that time also, a lot of us were being arrested by the police for organizing as students. Many of our comrades were also being killed from protest actions that were met with violence. And so it was just fire, you know. It was also the years of the necklacing, if you remember, the years of necklacing, with comrades were necklaced into Duza and KwaThema. And so all of that was happening at the same time. And my parents divorced when I was 7. So I grew up in the custody of my mom, who was a factory worker at telephone manufacturers. She's retired now. And I have 2 brothers who are equally politicized. And my eldest brother, very much part of the TEFLOP crew, you know, that studied in what is now the University of the North, but it has that history of vibrant political wigs. And my elder brother, Vista University, a teacher, was equally part of, you know, the movement there. And not very much organized. I think also as I grew up, I'm quite shaped by the role of care that women do, that is unrecognized and unvalued. And it's impossible to think about the celebration of our elders without thinking about, particularly I think about Mama Leah's role, that sometimes becomes so relegated to supporting Utatu Desmond. And yet we know that that role as a teacher, as a nurse, as a mother, you know, an important role that goes unrecognized. And it's important that we lift that and we value the role that women play, continue to play, that is unvalued and unrecognized in our society. Because when I think about some of the things that stood out, that continue to stand out for me, is how important it is to think broader than single issues. I think everything we have shaped, like I've organized as a student, organized as a lesbian in LGBTI rights. But I think some of the things we know today is that the systems of oppression do not challenge you only as a woman, do not challenge you as a lesbian, they challenge you in all forms that make the oppression, discrimination, and exclusion so profound. I mean, we look across the continent at the moment and we miss Utatu Arch very much in terms of his voice around LGBTI rights and dignity right now because of the violence of the waging and the protest against LGBTIQ people. I mean, it's global, but we also know that we cannot address that problematic only from a box of being LGBTI people. We have to address it as like a systemic strategy to actually make everyone who is different, women, HIV positive people, sex workers, and so on. So it's a challenge that we face today in terms of like making sure that the way in which we look at the contemporary challenges in our context is to look at it broadly and much more how the geopolitics play. And so I think when I think about what really has shaped me and what really is possibly one of my, I hope, an important contribution is that continuing not to think only in terms of like one problem in isolation to how the problems interlink, whether it's about why there's no electricity in our country, why there's no water, where are the interests lying? We can we can what, which is important against our government and what, but there's major corporations who have an interest in making sure that the poor and marginalized people remain poor and marginalized. And therefore our challenges are much more complex and we cannot simplify it. And therefore it requires complex responses as well to be able to do the activism that is necessary today. I mean, you can imagine in my time in the, the late 80s when I was coming out, of course, I was very much involved in how we could use things like corporal punishment to transform the school system, use things like school fees to campaign for free education for everybody, think about lunches and so on, but fight also against the Tuata, which was the apartheid set up teachers union, Transvaal United Teachers Association, something like that, which was set up by the apartheid government as a union, fight against those things, but also within trying to push to contribute to the struggles against apartheid. But that, of course, coincides with my own coming out period, right? Where with my comrades, they have to deal with the fact that I am a lesbian, I'm coming out, and I'm also occupying the student leadership position within my school and within Guatemala. And of course, what you get is what also sometimes we find ourselves in being challenged. Which struggle is more urgent than which struggle? So what you tend to do is to compartmentalize, right? Oh, and we saw that in the movement, in the broader movement, we saw it. LGBTI rights are not as important as the rights of Black people, but I'm a Black lesbian woman. No, they're not as important as a woman. Let's first deal with all of these big struggles, so to say, in inverted commas. And I think it's a constant thing, and it's a constant thing. We didn't necessarily overcome it, but many of us were members of the African National Congress when it was unbanned. And of course, the movements UDF, and so other structures that were affiliated to the ANC. And so being also part of like the broader movement was also important as a way to locate ourselves, our fullness, our bodies, our identities. I couldn't like now start appearing as Phumi, the Black youth, now as Phumi, the woman, now as Phumi, the lesbian, now as Phumi from the working class. No, I appear as my whole. I'm Phumi, who's a lesbian, Black woman. All of those are the identities. I couldn't leave anyone at the door. And I think, you know, there were very, very important things and leaps that we did. Many of us who were part of the ANC from the minute of unbanning, we positioned a resolution on the ANC recognizing LGBTIQ rights. It was passed, and it enabled the ANC to stand firm in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity right from the minute the draft constitution was formulated, that draft constitution that enabled us to vote, right? And important in that were also figures like the Arch, like the late Press Mandela, and many other people within the ANC who defended with us the retaining of the equality clause that then would enable us to engage in legal reform and constitutional law challenges in reversing all the laws that criminalized us based on sexuality. And then so for me, I think the important thing about that question remains that there is no way we could start like the Olympics of oppression. We are invited to see that one's fullness, dignity, freedom, and equity are like fundamental. We can't say we can only recognize you because you are Black, but not recognize you because you're a lesbian, you know, but I'm my full person.